Hi, I'm Joe, and I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction with this video. Because after many months of being hyper-focused on my household robot build, I feel the need to, well, as the kids say these days, touch grass. To get away from the digital world for a little bit. So I went outside to do that.
Yeah, maybe not. There's no grass.
Yeah, there's no grass out there. Still. Over the long winter, I've joined the ranks of the many people playing the newly released game Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. It's a historical fiction game based in the 1400s, where, well, you're adventuring around as a medieval knight. And this game inspired me to try building a crossbow. Now, I took a primitive wooden bow building class years ago, and really enjoyed it, but I've never built a crossbow. Now, coming from the standpoint that a crossbow is merely a bow mounted on a stick, maybe I could do this. The first thing was to find the wood that I was going to use, but I had the perfect piece. It was a big slab of red oak that I'd milled a few years ago. It's been air drying in the barn ever since. I kind of had to clear some stuff off of it, but I think it'll work quite well. So here's the piece of wood I'm going to be using. It's got pretty clean grain. It's not an ideal bow wood, but it's pretty good. The grain lines are fairly straight and no knots or anything. So I'm going to cut that up and see where it goes. It turns out there was actually a very small knot in the middle of this piece of wood I was cutting, but I just worked around it. The next step is to remove the bark. And we want to do this without cutting into the wood below the bark at all. We don't want to break that top grain. I'm going to use a draw knife. This is a really cheap one I got from Amazon. And you know, with hand tools, never buy the cheap one. It's really horrible. It won't cut wood really well, but it will take off bark. Now I'm going to stop here for just a moment and talk about why I don't want to cut into the top layer of grain. I'm using the outside of the tree for a reason. When you get a board from the hardware store, often the grain is wavy. I mean, that's how trees grow. But there are places where that grain exits the board out the side. And, you know, sometimes it'll surface and dive back in. And that's pretty and all, but that is where the board is going to break when you flex it. Because between the layers of grain, there's a soft layer, and that tears easily, and that's how wood splits. And when those layers are pulled apart, that's where the bow is going to break. The grain is going to delaminate, and that makes a thin spot right here, and that'll break too. Now, in using the very outside of the tree, we know that we have one continuous grain layer across the entire outside of the curve. On the inside of the curve, it's not as big a deal because the grain is going to be compressed together, and the soft layers between the hard layers of grain, they don't mind that. They're actually pretty good at taking compression. I think I've got it stripped back enough. Here's where I'm going to cut the stave down to length. I've just sort of chosen 3 feet long as being the length I want. I don't have any knowledge or research behind that. It just seems about right. Now, as you can see here, this edge of grain that we kept complete without cutting into it, that is slanted along with all of the grain lines, and we don't want that. So this whole section is going to be cut so that the grains run pretty much perpendicular to the direction the bow is facing. Now, this could be done with an axe or a chisel or anything that could cut wood, but I decided to use the bandsaw, which it turns out was quite dull, and I complained about it regularly. That took forever. The bandsaw blade is really dull. This little tiny bandsaw has a much newer blade on it, so I'm going to give that a shot for the next cut. Okay, now we have a nice clean stave. It's not a bow yet, but We're getting there. Now we need to make it bend. Let me explain this on the whiteboard. Now if you're bending a board of even thickness across a point in the middle, it's going to bend the most in the middle and break there. The idea is we need to spread that curve over the entire board. Now to visualize it, you could say the reason is leverage. See, the distance from the middle here to the outside is a big long lever. The distance from, say, right out here midway out on the limb, that's a much shorter lever, so it's receiving much less torque on it than the middle. Now the idea is to make the thickness of the board so that the amount of force it requires to bend at this point is equal to its lever length, and the amount of force it takes to bend at this point is equal to this greater lever length. So the bow will be thick in the middle and taper toward the ends. Now that sounds like a lot of complicated math, especially when you throw in inconsistencies of an organic material like wood. But the old craftsmen, who weren't big into numbers and measuring, had some really brilliant ways of accomplishing this very simply. Time-consuming, but not hard to do. The next step was to true up the sides of the stave and make them nice and straight. The traditional tool for this is a hand plane. And this is basically just a chisel set in a jig to cut a certain depth. And every time you scoot it along, it takes off just the top layer of wood. And it'll make a surface nice and smooth. I have a genuine love for this tool, but for the sake of, well, I'm a little bit lazy, I'm going to use a power hand plane. Let me show you that. Now, I've had traditional woodworkers sneer when I've mentioned use of this, but when I got into boat building, I found it very useful. It's the same thing as a hand plane, but instead of having a chisel, it has this rotating drum right here on the bottom. Very sharp little blade, and that drum rotates really fast. Tool's pretty dangerous from the bottom, but as long as you're holding onto it with two hands on the top, you're fine. This tool is really a pleasure to use, but the sound makes you want to leave your ears in a drawer at home. Now to create the profile of the front of the bow. We want it to be thick in the middle and taper toward the ends. Part of that is basically how sticks bend and what makes them break. And for that, I'll send you back to the guy with the whiteboard. We were already here. Ignore him. So I've marked out my taper here. I need to find that spot where the knot is. That knot looks like about 1/8 of an inch around. So I'm going to sort of just make a little bulge in the bow where it goes around that. Or actually, maybe I'll start my taper a little later. I used the small bandsaw to cut down the sides of the bow. And then, of course, I couldn't resist the opportunity to complain about a dull blade again. That blade needs to be replaced too. I can hardly steer it. And then fine-tune the cuts with a traditional hand plane. Now at this point, it won't even bend. It's too thick. The lens is all messed up. I can do chin-ups on it, but yeah, it won't bend. Okay, here comes the hard part. I got to start shaping this thing so it bends nicely. Now I've marked out a 2-inch gap in the middle. I'm going to leave that full thickness. And now I'm going to taper it toward the ends. And I've got a general idea of how thick the ends should be. So I'll start with that. It won't be enough wood taken off to make it really flex. But the idea is you never want to take too much off because you can't put it back on a bow. To cut this straight taper, I used the power hand plane again. And it took no time at all. Alright, here's the end of the straight cuts. Now, I've got to start taking out material in the belly of the bow. Sort of a concave curve. There's a couple of ways to do this. One is a wood carving rasp, which is pretty effective, and my favorite definitely for fine tuning. Concave curves are very hard with traditional woodworking tools. There aren't a lot of them that do it well. Now I'm using the rasp to take wood off the belly of the bow. You do this for about 8 years, or it feels like it. It feels like it takes forever. But anyway, you keep going until the bow is able to be flexed. Just a little bit. Now this is the point where we need to start being very careful about where and how we remove wood from the bow. Every little bit that we remove is going to change how this bow bends, and we need to concentrate on removing it from just the right spots so that the bow bends evenly across its width. Now it's time to put a loose string on the bow and make up a little jig by driving a nail into a scrap piece of wood to hold the bow into a slightly curved shape. Now we can measure this curve using a straight edge, and by measure I mean pretty much just eye it. You put a straight edge against the back of the bow and see how much it rocks back and forth, and you find the place where it's flattest. You mark that spot on the belly of the bow with a pencil, and then use the rasp to take away the wood on that spot, just enough to remove the pencil lines. You do this process until you forget your own name, and about that time the bow will be bending evenly. The bow is noticeably lighter now. It's almost April. Why is it snowing again? After what felt like an eternity of carving, I finally got a nice even curve on the bow. Now it's time to knock the ends, which in this case means carving out some grooves that the bowstring will actually sit in. I'm doing this with a rat tail file, and yes, I'm sitting on a rug, but see, it's in front of the fireplace, and so it's nice and cozy warm here. Then I took it out to the small bandsaw to cut off the remaining ends. Well, there, I finally gotten the bow strung. Now is the point when we start exercising the bow, trying to pull it back, and you don't want to pull it back any further than its final draw length, but also you don't want to pull on it with any more weight than its final draw weight. If we need to carve more material off, that just means it's probably going to bend better without breaking. Okay, now here I've got a bow scale, a Boyer scale, whatever it is. It's kind of like a fish scale, but it's meant for testing the drawstring weight on the bow. Got it many years ago. I don't know how much they cost anymore, but it was cheap back then. So I put it on the string and then start drawing it back to our draw length. So it has this little slider here that sticks wherever it last was drawn up to, and this says 47 pounds. Not great, but I'll take it. Now it was time to start carving out the stock. I'd never done this before, so I looked back at my video game reference. It seems that the bow is lashed to the front of the stock. You never want to put any holes or fasteners in a bow, so this makes sense. The stock seems to be basically a tapered stick, with a notch carved in the back to hold the string when it's drawn back, and then a trigger mechanism that somehow pushes the string upward to go over the ridge to shoot the arrow. The trigger itself seems to be a lever that hangs out the bottom, and when you pull it upward, it has a plunger of some sort that pushes the string up and over the notch that retains it. And so, armed with this extensive knowledge of crossbow design, I began the work. Cutting out and truing up the stock was the same process as I did with the bow stave. I decided instead of lashing the bow directly to the front of the stock, I want to create a notch to hold it in place more securely. I marked it out with a taper that matched the trapezoidal shape of my bow stave, and cut it with the bandsaw, which, the blade broke. Stupid dull bandsaw blade. And the dull bandsaw blade broke. But I forged ahead. There's more than one way to cut wood. Alright, I'm going to pull out this thing again, and I would like to see 60 pounds a draw. I've chosen that number, that's what I'm aiming for. Let's find out how far back it pulls. Not bad, that's 7.5 inches a draw. I wonder if I can go further. This is where the bow breaks, if it's gonna break. Tensions were high at this moment. Nice, 80 pounds. I don't really feel comfortable with going past that. 80 pounds draw weight though, not bad. With the draw length now known, it was time to start carving out the slot for the trigger mechanism. I started by drilling a couple of vertical holes right through the board. Then it was time for one of my favorite woodworking techniques of all, chisel carving. Probably the oldest type of woodworking, and it's very satisfying as long as you have patience and a good arm. Alright, now I've got a slot for the trigger mechanism to go through. Should be pretty simple, and there should be enough room for it in here. The next part is to cut this edge that the string hooks on when you cock it back. Well, now that I got the whole board in it, it's time to make the trigger mechanism. It's going to be sort of a weird shaped piece of wood, but the idea is it'll be a platform in this hole right here, and it's going to lift the string up over the notch that catches it. Making the shape of this is going to be an interesting process. Mostly kind of like everything else, you find out what wood needs to be removed and remove it and just go little by little. Alright, well there's a blank. We'll see how it fits. For this I've used yellow pine for a couple reasons. One is I had a little bit left over from some other project, but the other is it carves very, very easily. It's a soft wood and it really responds quickly to the chisel or any other tool you use. So it makes it pretty easy. Let's see how it fits for the first time. It doesn't fit at all. After a lot of small tweaks and adjustments, the trigger group started to work. So now it was time to create the slot that the arrow, or bolt, would sit in. I began with the circular saw, cutting a very shallow notch down the center line of the crossbow. Then I wrapped coarse sandpaper around a wooden dowel of the right diameter and sanded the rest away. This took quite a while. With that done, it was time to drill a couple of holes in the stock, one for the axle that the trigger rotates around, and the other for a binding post, which I can lash the bow to the stock with. And with that, it was finally time to assemble everything. I lashed the bow to the stock using more of that orange mason's line, and you also might notice that I have a piece of white foam between the bow and the stock. That's just there to be a shock cushion so that the stock won't crack when the bow fires. I don't know if that's even a problem, I'm just being cautious. The rest of the parts went together like a nice little kit. Alright, here goes the first pull. Works. Now you're not supposed to dry fire these things, so I'm going to hold on to the string right now. Yeah. Only mildly frightening. Now I needed a projectile, and having become kind of impatient at this point, I resorted to hot glue and cardboard and a stick. But with the help of the orange cat, we got it together. Alright, this is truly the first time I've ever tried firing this thing, so we'll see what happens. I'm going to try and shoot at that box right there, which isn't very far away. It actually looks further in the camera, but I don't know if it's going to shoot accurately or... Let's find out. We're back. Not accurate at all, but we'll try it again. Ooh, yeah. That's just a cardboard box, but it did bury it all the way up to the feathers. And there it is. I hope you enjoyed the video. I enjoyed making this. I kind of needed a break from the techie stuff. So, you know, leave a like, subscribe, whatever, if you want to. If you don't want to, don't do it. It's still winter outside, sorry. Bye. Still no grass.